Hello, everybody. Welcome. If you're just joining us, we will just let folks in out of the waiting room, and we'll go ahead and get started in just a moment. You can feel free as you're coming in to rename yourself if you so choose, so we know where you're coming from. You can, by all means, use the chat to greet people, and we will be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions. But we'll just give it a minute for people to come in and join us, and we will go ahead and get started in just a second. Okay, we know it's a busy and crazy and very, very eventful week for people, which is why we're going to go ahead and get started with this conversation. Thank you for joining us. My name is Beth Novak. I'm the director of the Governance Lab and the Burns Center for Social Change, and I am delighted to welcome you to this lecture on conversation on leveraging AI to promote free and fair elections. Our event today is also co-hosted not just by Burns and the Governance Lab, but also by the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University. And it is part of our ongoing lecture series, a link for which we'll put in the chat, on rebooting democracy in the age of AI, where we talk with visionary thinkers and doers and designers and technologists and change makers to examine the complex relationship between AI and governance, and to look at how we can use new technology to strengthen our democracy. We have a blog by the same name of Reboot Democracy that has news of the same vein, and we invite you to sign up for our mailing list. So I'm very delighted to be joined here today by Kate Gage, Executive Director of the Cooperative Impact Lab, as well as Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean, the president of FairCount, to have a conversation about what we can do to use AI to strengthen and improve our elections. Now, every time you turn around, there's another newspaper article about deepfakes and about the dangers of AI for our elections. And it's not without good reason. We all know about the robocall, the fake voice clone of President Biden calling voters in New Hampshire to tell them not to vote. We all see the daily news about the candidate who is in some sort of scandal, which turns out to be AI, and the candidates who excuse their behavior by telling us that it's AI. Today, what we want to do is to have a more balanced and a more nuanced conversation. Yes, about the risks, but also about the opportunities and the investments that we need to make in order to harness AI in support of better, stronger elections and stronger democracy. So we're going to start our conversation. I'm going to ask some questions of Jeanine and Kate, and hopefully they'll have a conversation with one another, but we want to invite you to join in that conversation. So please, if you have a question for them, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask that question. In addition, we welcome the conversation in the chat. Feel free to have talk with one another as we're talking. We welcome that conversation, but let me get us started, and then we'll bring you into the discussion as we go along. So welcome. First, I think it would be helpful to ask you both, even though we've put your bios in the chat, it would be helpful to have you both introduce a little bit about the work that you're doing. So maybe, Jeanine, you'd like to go first and just tell us about you and about FairCount for those who don't know.
Awesome. Well, I'm very excited to be here today. I'm Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean, president of FairCount. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization founded by Stacey Abrams, and we focus on civic engagement, all things civic engagement, all things democracy. So census, voting, redistricting, and we do deep dive, non-extractive community organizing every day of the year because we want to make sure that we are listening to the communities that we serve and that we're able to actively respond to the needs that they that they have to make sure that they are able to fully participate in our democracy. And just the background, the doctor in front of my name is because I was, I am an evolutionary biologist. I used to work at the CDC about 5.5 years ago before I was pulled over to Fair Count. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
That transition sounds like a story for another day, which maybe we'll get to, whether it was the right decision or not. But I'm hoping the answer is yes. Kate, please tell us about you and tell us about the myriad activities that you're involved in. Just give us a brief intro to Cooperative Impact Lab.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you guys for hosting us. Yeah, so I run an organization called Cooperative Impact Lab. We look a lot at the adoption cycle of technology across political organizations, advocacy groups, nonprofits. I used to work a lot. I used to work at the federal government during the Obama administration on sort of tech and innovation and data in the context of global development, working at USAID. And after the 2016 election, switched over looking more at, the question of how we have so much at our disposal around technology and access and data and analytics, and what happens when that tries to reach state-based groups, organizations that are working on the ground with different communities. I used to work a lot with Democratic state parties and looking at their tech adoption. So Fair Count and Jeanine's work really fits into that category of the sort of like, there's so much opportunity and potential. I think a lot of us here know that potential of technology and what we're sort of told about what it can do does not always equate to adoption on the ground, especially by some of the less resourced or more grassroots or just smaller organizations and campaigns who in many ways need it most. So we, in the last year and a half, have been focusing a lot on AI, experimentation, and adoption. We've run 2 cohorts of organizations, of which Fair Count was in our cohort last year, looking at what does it take to get these organizations to experiment with them, think about it, learn about it, get access to training and coaching. And then in this last summer, we ran a series of AI for organizing and campaigns hackathons. We ran 3 of them in San Francisco, New York, and Chicago. We were lucky enough to have Beth at our New York event. And we gave organizations an opportunity to bring a real challenge and bring a real problem that they've encountered and say, is this a applicable use for AI? Is this something that AI would be good at? Is it something that's feasible? And really got to see some of that on the ground, real world experimentation through those days. We attempted to we made hackathons fun again. Bringing back the hackathon was my summer. And so I have some stuff from that I'm looking forward to talking about. And yeah, so that's some of the work we've been doing.
Awesome. So I think just to help people understand what that looks like really concretely, Jeanine, if you want to talk a little bit about the project that you've done together, so we can understand what it looks like, just very practically, concretely. What are we talking about when we mean AI for better elections? What are you up to?
Yeah, so as Kate said, Fair Count was a part of the experimental generative AI cohort. And as a part of that, we were really thinking about how we could use AI with our organizing. So as I said, Fair Count, our organizers are on the ground 365 days a year. So we are primarily in rural communities, talking to people, doing one-on-ones, door knocking, phone banks, all of that stuff. But our data director, Thomas Whitaker, really designed this pilot project to figure out how we could better collect information from potential voters at the door. So typically now when you do canvassing, you knock on all the doors, you put the limited information in minivan, and then at the end of the day, you kind of have to remember, well, oh, I did talk to this woman and she said she had a plan, but I can't remember what door that was, what street it was. And so the idea was, how do we collect that information in real time? And so Thomas designed essentially a pipeline using voice memos. So when we tested it out, we did this in Mississippi, my home state. And our canvassers would go talk to someone at the door. And then before they moved to the next door, they would leave themselves or record a 30 to 90 second voice memo. hey, I talked to Miss Mary. She says she has a plan to vote. Her cousin's going to pick her up on election day at noon and she's ready to go. Or I talked to Mr. Charlie and he said he doesn't want to vote because he doesn't like anybody. Or, but being able to collect that information. And then once we had those voice memos, we then transcribed them into text and then ran the text through Claude, which is an LLM similar to ChatGPT. And then we were able to do sentiment analyses to get an idea of what people were saying on the ground. And we were able to break this out by county, and even ask Claude some questions about, are there areas where, or communities where the estimated turnout might be inflated. And what Claude did based on those answers, based on those responses, and I apologize, I have a child who's standing here like trying to get my attention. So shut that door real quick. But it's my child, not some random child. So we were able to ask Claude, are there areas where this might be inflated? These responses might be inflated. And it looked at 2 counties in Mississippi. Coahoma County in the Mississippi Delta. And in that community, a lot of the responses were like, I have a plan. I'm going on my lunch break. Very active, certain words about what people, were going to do. And then in Forest County, which is in Hattiesburg and South Mississippi, the more vague language. Yeah, I'm going to vote. I'm going to do it. Yeah, I'll commit, that kind of thing. And so it turned out that Coahoma County actually had one in the 2023 statewide elections. Coahoma County in the Delta, with that, those stronger languages, a lot stronger language, actually had one of the highest turnout rates in the state. And then in Forest County, where you had the more vague language, you did see that the turnout was lower than predicted. And so again, this is a pilot project based off of 200 or so voice memos, but even to be able to tease some of that out is just really, really exciting and I think promising. And then we also did the hackathon, but we can get to that at another point. The hackathon was super fun. I hadn't done one, and the fact that the programmers were able to come up with, actually able to develop a functional app in a few hours was mind-blowing. So it was super duper cool.
That is the AI world, or the Gen AI world in which we now live, that has come such a long way. So let's talk about, particularly with this ability to do things like this that are fully functional so quickly that you were able to deploy in the field. I'd love to hear from you, really sort of from your perspective, whether it's what worked and what you want to do more of, what didn't, or what you want to do next.
So in the pilot, all of those analyses were done after the election because we were real busy, right? And so we ran, all the analysis were ran post-election. What we would love to, the idea going into the hackathon was, how do we create a functional app that could be where we could get the data in real time that could be used to inform our canvassers on the ground. So if I'm walking into a community, I get my list and I see, hey, the script told me to talk about this, but all of a sudden I'm seeing that these sentiments, people really care about jobs, people care about healthcare. As a canvasser, that helps me go and, it helps me interact with the voter in a more effectively. So instead of being like a generic, hi, I'm Jeanine, I'm talking, I want to make sure you have a plan to vote, I can look at the data in real time and say, hey, we've been talking to your neighbors and that pothole on Main Street is really bothering people. That's what everybody's talking about. Do you know who, what elected official is responsible for road quality? You should really look into that if that's something you care about. And so it allows more of a personal, a better in to get people engaged, because you're talking about things that actually matter to them. And so moving forward, even with the app that we were able to develop, moving forward, and I hope that one of the plans is to really build this out next year when things calm down a little bit, hopefully in election world, is to really sort of build out this, a tool that can be used in real time to get these very, more localized sentiment analyses that we can use to inform how we engage, not just with voters, but even when we're thinking about, I'm thinking 2030 with the census. how do I identify topics that people actually care about to make them care about participating in the census? So that's what I see moving forward.
And
Kate,
Beth,
anything? Yeah, please jump in.
I would just say that one of the things that's so exciting about this, I remember exactly when Thomas and Jeanine last year kind of were like, could this be a thing we could do with AI? Because they were in our first cohort. And one of the really critical points of that cohort and of the work that we've been doing is this kind of like, folks, there's a big gap, right, around what people know and understand about how it works or the risks but also just about the potential, about the technology. It's very easy to kind of assume that folks kind of generally know how it works or what it does or what's good about it or not. And so to really be able to bring leaders like Jeanine and Thomas and their team into a space of saying, oh, okay, so that's what it's good at, that's what it's bad at, that's where the potential goes, and then bring their own experience of what is needed for their space, is what's so exciting. And I think one of the things to really put a point on this specific project is, for those of you who have done canvassing, and I imagine many of you are maybe doing it this year, or if you're not, there's a great opportunity this weekend to get out there wherever you are and participate. It's a really fascinating sort of UX problem, but those conversations that folks have on the doors for the entire history of door-to-door canvassing has largely been lost. That information has largely been lost, and if anything, folks are kind of getting, a check box, or maybe they're using one of the apps where they're able to kind of put notes in it afterwards. But as Jeanine mentioned, it's the nuances, and it's the elements of the conversation and the dialogue that we have seen so much potential around AI to actually pull out and create meaningful information out of that unstructured data. That's sort of like, this is one of those ones where capturing what's happening on these conversations and on the doors, especially around sentiment, is sort of like one of these like holy grails of organizing and campaigning. Like, it is just one of the places where information has been lost for years. And this is it's sort of like when you hear it, you're like, oh, obviously that should exist. And so to Jeanine's point, it's really interesting to think about what could that look like. We also had at the hackathon, we had two companies who build canvassing software. They were there and they heard this idea and they said, oh, we should actually incorporate that into our software as well. So it's interesting to kind of see the different pipelines of how it goes, but really putting a finer point on that, like why this is so interesting and creative, and sort of and new.
So do you have, just to, bring in the risks that usually lead all these conversations, if it bleeds, it leads here. There is so much concern and hand-wringing over voter manipulation and voter abuse. And Jeanine, you started right off the bat talking about non-extractive organizing, and really engaging in doing civic engagement in ways that are respectful of people as humans and respectful of human rights and civil rights. So I'm wondering, are there guardrails that we need, or what are the ways that we can to ensure that we are responsible? And what does responsible and ethical mean here in terms of how we're thinking about using AI for getting out the vote and campaigning and organizing of the kind you're talking about? Obviously, what you and your organizations bring to this ensure that these are good projects, but are you worried about the flip side?
Definitely. I think we have to be cognizant of ways that this can be used to harm people. The thing that immediately comes to me is privacy. And this stems back to when I worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. PII that was drilled into us. There were points at the CDC where I could have identified a person based on like their age and race, and what I could, and said, oh, that guy over there has this, condition. And I just think that we have to keep that in mind. The pilot project that we didn't tie those voice notes back to individual doors. It was like I said, at the county level. And while I think that it is, and I love data, I'm a scientist, right? Ecology, evolution, and behavior. I did computational work, like all the good stuff. But I respect people, and I respect people's privacy. And I feel that if we don't put in ethical and sufficient guardrails that it could be used not only, for micro targeting, but I also don't want to say something at the door and then see that it was, it was attributed to me. And, I think it could, if it's not done correctly, it could really destroy trust that people have in organizing in general. And so I think we just have to be cognizant, thoughtful, and ethical about how we utilize this information and how we are able to connect it back to individuals.
Kate, anything else you want to
No,
dive in and
yeah.
add there, or?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a really interesting, I agree. Yeah, like there's the ways that we baked into some safeguards here, right? As Jeanine mentioned, not recording the actual conversation, not tying it directly to a voter. There's obviously ways that could be interesting to do, but yeah, and I think those are sort of the initial safeguards. I think the more that we understand where these potential risks are, or like where the ways that this, we do have to be clear about like data retention, where this sits, where it lives, what model we're using. There's like a lot of intentionality that has to go into something that's being rolled out like this in some larger way. I do think that there's something about the sort of analysis of larger unstructured data sets in a way that sort of informs teams that feels different from the conversation around sort of like deep fakes or around sort of like micro targeting in a different way. Just because it is sort of consistently, there is more of the sort of like human in the loop element of it, of thinking about like what are informational data points that can be given to campaign managers, campaign directors, staff, to just better understand the communities. And how can we kind of center that as the goal, as opposed to kind of going off into these places where it could be, tied to individual voters or PII. So again, it's not entirely baked out, but I think that there's a lot of sort of ways of centering sort of safer usages here than kind of diving immediately into just creation of like more data tied to individual people.
Now, one of the great, of course, dangers and challenges is how the money in politics excludes so many people. So when we're talking about the risks and the dangers here, we are already, experiencing the worst given the corruption that comes from the money in our system. So I'm wondering if you can also talk a little bit, not necessarily to the innovation aspect here, but to the efficiency questions here. Is AI enabling us to do things that have been cost prohibitive before? And what do those look like? And what are the things, what are the elements of campaigns or elections where we can really bring down the costs with AI? And what does that mean in terms of power dynamics?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I think that there was a lot, obviously, really brought up last year, beginning of this year, of sort of, is this going to be the AI election? Like, how much are campaigns going to be utilizing AI sort of across the board in their various different capacities? I think in general, it did not, at least to my perception, like really reach that like level of fervor that I think folks were expecting. And in a lot of ways, that's due to some point to the technology adoption challenges that we have across the political and nonprofit space in general. Like it is sort of notoriously difficult to get campaigns and organizations to adopt technology and new technology, and somewhat, especially ones that have potential higher risk or ethics or higher price tags in general. And so I think that is part of it. But what we have seen a lot around generation. There's been some studies that have been done that I can link to around, the effectiveness of AI generated imagery, audio. We definitely know that has been used a lot. Those are definitely things that cost a huge amount of money to, create a political ad, to even create things like B-roll. I had a really interesting conversation with a lawyer, an elections lawyer a couple years ago or last year, around how much of how much money lawyers, campaigns spend on lawyers to evaluate how much of an ad is from a campaign and how much of it is original content, or because that you're only allowed to use like up to 49% of an ad can actually come from a campaign if you're a sort of independent organization doing elections work. And he was kind of like, can they create B-roll that's AI generated of sort of like the back of the head of a candidate walking down a street or something like that, that would then not have to go into that 49% or that evaluation of what the lawyers are doing? And I was like, yeah. And again, of course, I'm not bringing up deepfakes or bringing up like that. That's obviously going to be something that you're in there. But there are some of those just little things where you're sort of like, yeah, we know that campaigns are using it for image generation. We know they're using it for fundraising campaign, fundraising content, for ads, for audio, which is one of the biggest expenses. And I think that is a place where, like, at least there's different goals you could look at combating campaign finance rules, but or campaign finance, like the challenge of money in politics. But definitely one of the big ones is just smaller campaigns, with less budget, having access to, really what you can do with a big campaign, what you can do with a big budget. And so in that ways, I think we have seen some of that sort of evening the playing field in some ways.
So I'm curious, again, sort of trying to balance these risks against the benefits. There's another area of great concern for people that they tend to talk about is the issue of what's sometimes called micro-targeting. Now, this may not be an issue related just to AI. It may be a broader question of what you think is the purpose of campaigning and organizing. So micro-targeting in the sense that I can personalize my messaging more easily, and thereby either persuade, positive, or manipulate, negative. Do you see AI as really allowing us to do one better than the other? Again, are there ethical implications here, or is this not unique to the AI world, and are people worrying unnecessarily? Or are you afraid that the examples that we've seen in the past of, for example, candidate Bush darkening his skin tone to make himself more likable to Black and brown voters by colorizing images of himself, and thereby manipulating voter sentiment, is that going to get worse with AI?
You want to take it?
Yeah, hadn't thought about that. I do think we run a risk with micro targeting again. Not even just the data linkage. I think people get weirded out when you know too much about them personally. If somebody like if you come up to me and like, hey, I know you really like almond joys, vote for this candidate. Like that's gonna be like, hey, are you a stalker? Like, where'd you get that information from? Who's watching me? And so I think for me, the micro targeting, and even if from the perspective of a community organizer, that's why we're sort of getting these sort of higher level ish, the community, your neighbors are saying this versus you said this. And again, if someone comes to my door a year later and says, remember when you were talking to that random person that knocked on the door, you said that this is what you cared about, that's going to freak me out. And so I'm always thinking about how people react to it. And I think that it could again be a major turnoff for people answering the doors, which again, if anyone knows, or if anyone's ever knocked doors, you're like, everybody doesn't answer. You can hear the people inside and they're not coming to the door. So to be able to get someone to actually engage with you, I think if you're too focused and too micro-targeted, you're going to put people off, and it's going to decrease the effectiveness of canvassing.
So Kate, before you say anything, I just want to remind people we're getting to the point where we want to bring in your questions. So if you have them, please put them in the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Beth, it's a great example, right? It's like, this has been happening forever, right? Is it making it easier to generate imagery? Of course it is. Is it making it faster to do some sort of manipulation? It definitely is. And do we have some potential for, will we be seeing that type of micro-targeting? Yes. Does that mean it will translate to sort of exactly that, like widespread impact or like more or intent or different impact or like deeper impact of those images, I think that sort of remains to be seen. We and there's also sort of the other side of it, right? Which is that, I mean, and also on micro-targeting, like we've been trying, there's so much data analysis and so much money put into micro-targeting across the political space at all times. And most of the tools I feel like I've been seeing get traction this election cycle. There's been a lot of sort of message testing ones. So less about micro-targeting or even sort of like that type of like manipulation or image manipulation, but more trying to determine what effective and persuasive content is. And again, helping those smaller campaigns, smaller organizations who don't have access to, you know, a full-time pollster or to be able to run these big panels on their messaging, but helping them sort of say like, I have an idea for something. Do we think this would be persuasive? And of course that gets into like the folks who are building those tools need to be pretty sure about what they believe to be true about that message analysis. But, you know, there are some of those ways where I feel like we're seeing more of the effectiveness go into the kind of like back end support for campaigns and less necessarily in the effectiveness of that. I mean, as you mentioned, we've seen a lot of these like the deep fake voices as well. Yeah, I think that's just a general risk that campaigns have not really been willing to take at scale, right? They've seen some of the negative press that comes out from doing the kind of deep fake voices, and you know, folks have been a little bit hesitant to do that at any sort of large adoption scale.
So let's we have so many questions coming in various places, the Q&A, the chat, etc. Let me start to bring some of these into the discussion. Both David and Jake are asking questions about trust. And so David makes the point that we're in an environment in which people are very untrusting of one another, of the facts, of elections. That distrust is also being manufactured. Do you see AI as being a way to enhance that trust, or is it further undermine that trust? How are you teaching people essentially to trust that these kinds of tech-enabled interactions are working? And whether that's for, again, the recipient, that, you know, Pennsylvania voter who's hiding behind their door all weekend, or whether it's the canvasser whom you're sending out into the street, what's the reaction in terms of trust?
I can go from the perspective of the organizer. I do think that we have to educate people about what AI is. There's so much out there right now that people automatically, I think, distrust it because you know, it's all been doom and gloom. The AI overlords are going to take over this, and you know, and I think that until people really understand what it is and how it can be used, you're going to have that distrust. But again, I think that it comes down to like digital, how do you use it for digital relational organizing in my mind? How do you, and the key part of that is the relational. How do you let people know, you know, how you're using this and how it's able to allow you to understand more about their community, and you know, and let people know that you're listening to them, and this is just another tool to listen to them. But again, that comes down to the the person aspect of it. If we rely on, you know, just saying this AI tool this AI this AI that, it's not gonna work. But if we actually take time and talk to people and help people understand what's going on, then I think we can mitigate some of that distrust that's naturally going to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with that. Again, it's sort of like it is consistently about the organizing is at core much, you know, a human to human interaction, right? Like that is where it is effective. That is where you have the, you know, the concepts. I mean, a lot, what that question brings up a lot is like one thing that's brought up a lot in organizing and messaging, which is like literally referred to as the trusted messenger, right? Like a lot of what you do in organizing and what Jeanine's organization does and what organizations all over the country do is essentially like spend their own personal capital and building relationships across their community so that when there's a critical message to be communicated, they are seen as those trusted messengers. Right. I think Jeanine, obviously right now we're seeing that happening across the country. This is a place where some of these longer term organizing power building groups like Fair Count have that, a bit of that, the edge over some of the campaigns that stand up, in a much more quick, rapid succession and sort of the boom and bust of the election cycle. And sort of, to that point, I mean, I think a lot of what we can do here, a lot of what I think my last year and a half has been focused on is that in order to answer that question and to think about how to continue to center trusted messengers as a sort of critical element of organizing is we need leaders like Jeanine, and we need leaders like campaign managers, organizational leaders, nonprofit leaders, folks who are doing this work to understand what AI is, how it works, what its risks and concerns and ethical concerns are, and what their applications are. I think we're seeing so much of folks either being afraid of it or not having the time or, time or ability, time to like really understand it. Not having those pathways that are centering, EDs, campaign managers, candidates in that kind of process of educating people about it. And so then what we're resulting in is that there's just not enough people in the conversation, in the dialogue. There's not enough people who think about trust and think about, human community trust to be informing some of these companies or some of these policymakers or some of these dialogues around it. That's another, one of the reasons I'm so glad we have Jeanine here. From the day one of talking to Jeanine. Jeanine, you had such a great message of, we can't be left behind, right? Like this space can't be left behind. And I think one of it is like, what does it mean to do it? So that I don't mean to like, that feels like a little bit of a dodge of the question of like, how do we ensure that trust is there? But I think that if we don't have the people whose literal jobs it is to be building that trust with people centered in this conversation and in conversations like this, they're not going to be pushing the dialogue in that direction.
Exactly, Kate. And if I can just add one more thing onto that, I've had conversations with my counterparts in the civic engagement space. And there are folks who are like, I don't want to learn about it, right? They're just like, this is too much for me. And I'm just going to do what I do. But I think Kate is exactly right. You have to take time. I understand that I come from my background as a scientist. I was probably more open to learn about AI and being able to sort of comprehend how it works. But I've also been in trainings that have been done that are specifically focused on civic engagement leaders to talk to them about AI, not necessarily just for canvassing, but just the general overview. Because Kate's right. If we don't have the folks that are leading these organizations open to thinking about it, and it gets to, I see another question in the Q&A about like people adopting it. So like canvassers adopting it. There were people on my team who were like, what? We're doing what with AI? But because you're able to talk to them and say, this is what we're doing, this is it, this is that, it builds that trust. But if you don't have someone on the team that can explain it and that can answer questions about it, again, you're going to, there's going to be a lack of adoption and that the persistence of mistrust.
Absolutely. So I think just as a gentle plug at the same time, let me put, I've lost the chat button. Too many windows here. I'll put a link in the chat here to a piece written by some of my colleagues that I got to put my name on, which talks about the importance of doing things like centering workers in the conversation about how we're using these technologies in the workplace. And similarly, as you're saying, the people who are the organizers and the activists and the canvassers need to be in the center of these conversations about how we're using these tools for elections, for organizing, etc. And so to that end, I'm wondering just what your sense is, and I want to come back to some of the things in the chat, but what's your sense about who needs to do the building? is clearly who needs to be at the table is clear. But we've seen a lot of concerns expressed about commercial AI platforms, the chat GPTs of the world, spitting out misinformation. We've heard about Alexa telling you that it's not going to give election information and then giving you some election information and not for others. Do you have a sense of either who needs to do the building or how these things need to get built or designed that you think is important here? And you've both, you, especially Kate, you have a lot of companies involved in these hackathons. I'm just wondering how you see the opportunity here for public-private civic collaboration.
Yeah, we have seen a number of companies who come explicitly out of the political and campaign and sort of progressive space build AI companies in the last year. We've seen there's one group that we've worked with a couple times called Change Agent, who's building a specifically like progressive LLM that like that really focuses on progressive values and that the communications and the what is generated by it will be much more sort of like progressive values and progressive messaging. That those folks come out of sort of progressive organizing space. I think as we are seeing access to open source models and we are seeing some of these tools become more sort of generally available for prototyping things, we're starting to see more of that. We've seen a lot around fundraising, a lot around message testing, a lot around even just sort of internal, how do you help an organization understand what information they have and make that accessible? Seeing that started to be for sort of like direct service groups. But a lot of that coming out of the folks who've already been building technology in this space for a long time so that they kind of innately understand the risks, the challenges, the ethics, sort of like the demographics of the community that folks are working with. I think industry is harder, sort of like big I industry. We have not really interacted very much directly with the sort of OpenAIs and Anthropics of the world. Partially that's because we do see these policies come out that are just sort of like the blanket, no politics, no communications. We see that to be generally folks seem to be like finding their ways around that if that's a thing that they really won't want to be doing, or there's been a lot of questions of just like who is actually like, are people actually being kicked off of these platforms for doing it, or are they just able to do like different prompting? That's not something I'm encouraging, but I would say that that's definitely kind of it's felt like there's a lot of kind of band-aids being put out by industry that sort of seem to be trying to get at like the trying to sort of like put a solution to something that is like likely not going to actually restrict it or like actually get in the way. But I would love to see more sort of collaboration across that space. I would love to see there be, even more solutions that are made available for this space, not just in terms of centering, but also just even on like pricing, right? It's just the number of organizations that we work with who don't have any budget to pay for a paid account on OpenAI, right? Or like Claude, it's just like the number of organizations that we've worked with where we're like, well, of course you're on, you at least have the paid version. And they're like, no, we don't. Means that a lot of these organizations are also not protected by the additional protections that a lot of the paid accounts give. So I remember even back in the 2018 election cycle, I was working with a very well-known, very large technology company. This is sort of before the AI world, who they did not have two-factor authentication on their free accounts. And I remember sitting in the office and going, well, that like most campaigns are using the free account, right? You do know that. And they're sort of like, well, yeah, but we want those campaigns to have, security, and we don't want them to get hacked on our platform. And we're like, well, cool. You might want to consider putting two-factor authentication on the free version, because, and there's just this like, that again is like that disconnect where they had not considered that some of these organizations and campaigns wouldn't have the like $12 a month to put, like per user or per seat to like pay for those things. So there is definitely that still kind of like, how is this being used? and how is it being designed? And I do not, I think we're still at a place where those two things are not the same.
So you have a
Yeah.
couple of questions, but go ahead. Sorry.
One thing I'll add on to that, I ended up doing describing this pilot project at an event, and there was a representative from a major technology company that is not currently, well, they do some AI, but a major technology company who was like, we would love to build this for you, right? You're talking all the money from these people and, all this support. And my initial reaction was like, ooh, because I immediately thought of the data and who controlled the data and how that would impact the communities that we're trying to serve. It was sounds great to have a corporation build something out for you, but there's so many hidden things that I think we do have to be very thoughtful about how we, interact with corporations around not just data privacy, but just what are you going to do with it in general, was something that popped up for me.
So you have a few questions sort of in the chat and in the Q&A that come back to the example, the particular project that you worked on together. So Shreya asked a question about whether you experienced any hallucinations or exaggerations that emerged as a result, or were there any problems that happened? And then there was another question somewhere up here from Hayes, who also asked about what kinds of just beyond the problems, what kind of actionable insights were actually generated.
I would say that, again, just to remind y'all that for the pilot project, we're talking like 200 data points. And so, yes, hallucinations were definitely something that we were cognizant of. And that's also why when I was telling doing the overview, even when we were able to pull out, here are some general sentiments for this county or that county, we took it with a grain of, this is a small sample size. And that's another reason why I also want to build this out next year and to do a more robust study to see what, how often are we experiencing our hallucinations going to be an issue? How often are, if we run it multiple times, are we getting different answers on the same data set for the same question? Those are the types of things that I'd like to tease out. But the scientist in me says that data set is too small, and I'm not ready to. That's why I want to do a little bit more before we sort of start to pinpoint how we can build this out a little, build this more. But Kate, I don't know maybe in some of the other projects, if that was an issue.
I do remember, Jeanine, I feel like when we first did it, it did not get the math right particularly well.
Mm-hmm.
We sort of asked it for, like what percentage of responses did X, Y, Z? I think the math has gotten better since then.
Yeah.
It was sort of during one of the like earlier phases where a lot of the models were just like terrible at math.
Mm-hmm.
So we definitely saw that. We did go back through and do a pretty, if I remember, we did some pretty deep analysis of like, was this hallucination? We did a lot of manual review. So I don't think we saw, I really don't feel like hallucination was like a huge issue in that one situation. I do, of course, as we hit a larger scale, if this were to be something that we'd rolled out broader, we could definitely see that be a concern. Yeah, I mean, and Hayes, to your question, I think it's so interesting because it's like you do think about collecting this on a larger scale. I think I could imagine a lot more information about, Jeanine mentioned like the issues that people are interested in, but I think also, I do love the example that she gives of like the immediate thing that is bothering people, right? Like the power outage, the pothole. Is that a thing that you could then, of course, like incorporate into, your candidates' speeches or to mailers or communications or like, or see someone do something about it.
Yeah.
That is that really interesting element of the fact that we have this weekend, there will be thousands and thousands of people out there knocking on doors every single, everywhere across this country, especially in swing states. And it's just kind of like, yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to be really interesting. Maybe it's not actionable for like changing messaging in the last couple days. But if you do imagine a world where there's a report given to campaign managers in the evening of like, these are the top themes that came up, to the candidate, like something like that, like these are the things we're hearing. That's a completely new set of information that we've just not had. I don't know, Jeanine, if you had something else.
That was the impetus for the hackathon, and it was also building it not just on the data that was collected at the doors, but again, Fair Count, we've been in existence for 5.5 years, and we've been doing this community organizing. A big part of what we do are these one-on-one conversations, these much longer conversations with community members, and we don't just talk about census, voting, redistricting. We ask, like, how far do you have to go to get to a grocery store? How far is there a doctor? Is there a hospital in your community? We're even asking questions about like climate change and, relating that back to being, to voting and being civically engaged. So we have this massive database already of this qualitative data. And so ideally, we would be able to overlay canvassing data on top of that and then pull out, just like Kate was saying, I would love to go into a community, and the app was designed to pull up the 5 top sentiments or topics that people were talking about in that community. And I think that to me is sort of the like the grail, to be able to again go and have these conversations with people based on things that they actually care about, even if you sort, and then also to look at how it changes over time. So if we see that stuff that we were talking to people about in 2019 is popping back up in 2028, that we can still go back and, and I think it makes it that much easier to talk to people, because we can say, this is still an issue in your community. This is why you need to be engaged this many years later to make a difference in that.
So I want to, as we get to the bottom of our hour, I want to bring in Serena's question to really ask you to kind of fantasize not about this week's election, but about the next election. So she puts it as, what big problems would you like to see solved, or developments would you like to see by the next election cycle? I would ask you to just tell us a story or paint us a picture. What does the next election cycle look like with AI?
You want to start, Kate?
Yeah. I think, as we know and have already seen, right, so much of this is just like integrating into existing tools. I mean, in the same sort of way that I mentioned about campaigns and organizations not having budget for paying for paid chat accounts. It's remarkable how many times I'm sort of like, well, that Zoom has an AI transcript, and Zoom has AI tools, and they're just like, oh, thank you. Because then procuring one more tool, or like paying for one more separate thing, and like, getting the ops department to sign on for something is just going to be so, so with like Google and as Microsoft and others roll it out. So, I think one big thing is just, how does this start getting integrated in day to day, right? Like, what are we seeing around just existing tools that are many of the same tools that folks are using across the board. And then I think that also extends out to the political technology tools. We did not see, I saw someone in the chat, I'll respond a little bit about the sort of data, voter file data issue that Wendy brought up in the chat. Separate, but you bring up Minivan. For folks who don't know, is like the mobile version of a technology called Van, which is sort of where most Democratic campaigns use as kind of like their CRM, and for managing canvassing and applications. They did not develop any AI tools this cycle that they rolled out to the country, as far as I know. If I'm mistaken, but to my knowledge, they did not sort of jump on this and roll out, this, what Jeanine talked about could be a functionality, other sort of data analysis, generation kind of things. And that's a tool that's used by 90% of Democratic campaigns across the country, not including sort of nonprofit organizations that use a version of it. So I think the big thing is just like incorporating AI functionality into existing tools is just going to be a thing that we see. Obviously, as we see where kind of like regulation, watermarking, content, visual content generation restrictions, that could be very interesting. But I'm very curious I feel like I hear so many politicians just being like, AI, we just need to talk about deep fakes. And it's like, well, sure, that's fine. And we do, not to diminish that, but it's like there's so many other interesting possibilities that really help folks. So I think we're going to see a lot integrated. I think we're going to see, but I mean, I think, and this is fundamentally why why I love the Fair Count and Jeanine's project so much, is it gets at a completely different way of doing something that people are already doing that is centering their specific example. And those are the ones I'm most excited about, that I'm like, I don't know. We know one of our other hackathon winners was around disinformation in multiple languages. It was about analyzing YouTube disinformation in Hindi, specifically focused on Indian American populations. And it was just like wild to think about the possibilities around language that just have not been possible before. So I'm both optimistic and cautiously optimistic, but I think language, large data analysis, unstructured data analysis around unstructured information and data, and then just some of the like efficiencies are things that a lot of these groups could really benefit from.
So before we run out of time, let me just let folks here know that if they want to stick around and ask some more questions, I think you've both agreed if just stick around a few more minutes after the end of our live stream. If you have time, we know this is an extraordinarily busy week for everybody. But if people feel there are questions that have gone unanswered, I will make that offer. But let me just make sure we close not by talking about 2028, but by talking about 2024. Nothing to do with AI, or yes to do with AI. What would you have all of us do this week and next week? Give us your advice. What should we be doing to help get out the vote and to help preserve the integrity of the election? So on topic, off topic, tell us what we can be doing to ensure the strength of our democracy in the coming days.
I can start. I don't assume that everybody votes. So my first thing is to please go vote. If you haven't already, to make a plan to vote. One of the things, and you just mentioned it, is dis and misinformation around the election. And, as Kate said, it is, trusted voices in your community. You're a trusted voice. I've been in this space for a minute, and I still have close friends who are calling me and telling me that they're not going to vote in this election. And I have to, then have conversations with them, answer their questions, and try my best to convince them to participate. And so I think everybody probably has somebody like that in their sphere. And so if you can take the time out to actually talk to people, to answer questions, to guide them to information, to encourage them to participate, I think that's probably one of the most effective things that individuals can do. And then on top of it, go knock some doors, like volunteer for some phone banks and some text banks to help get out the vote. But those personal conversations that you can have with people that could be the difference between them participating and staying on the sidelines.
Kate, anything else you'd have us do? And Jeanine, if there's specific links or places people should go to sign up,
you can go to
by all means, share them.
faircount.org and volunteer. So, yes.
Yeah, just relational, right? Again, this is where AI can be helpful, but is not really, call your friends in Pennsylvania, call your friends in, in Georgia, in Texas, have that conversation. Just check in. I think it's always remarkable how often, I think to Jeanine's point, you kind of just assume everyone's out there doing it, and you talk to them and they're like, they're not. So, it's the personal touch.
Well, as to why not, that's another big question that we'll have to get into, and how to have those conversations. We'll put another link in the chat to some interesting research that's just come out about ways of using AI to bridge those divides in conversations. I'll try to put that right now. Some really interesting research, and we're going to make that part of our lecture series coming up in the spring. We'll be hearing from the folks at DeepMind who are doing this work on using AI to help bridge those very partisan divides that are happening now in so many conversations in America. But Let me take a moment to thank you officially as we move to wrap our live stream and the official part of the program, and just thank both Jeanine and Kate, not just for joining us here today on this incredibly busy week when they're both so engaged in so many activities, but for the work that you do all year to help safeguard our democracy and to use technology in the process. So we're just really, really grateful for all of your efforts. If you enjoyed this conversation, please come back and join us for our next one, which will be with Frank McCourt on November 19th, talking about his new book called not Rebooting Democracy, his new book, which is called, sorry, we're going to put it in the chat. It's 5 o'clock, which means I can't remember anything. Frank McCourt of Project Liberty, what I can tell you is doing really amazing work to ensure that we build a public, free, and open internet, which is the basis of our democracy, and in the process is also trying to buy TikTok to be able to ensure that we can perhaps salvage our social media from the dumpster fire that it is. So join us on November 19th for that. Thank you to both of you for joining us. Thank you to all of you for your good questions. And we'll end our live stream, and I'll open it up for a few more minutes to see if there's anything else at this point. If you have a comment or question that you feel was unanswered, please raise your hand. And we invite you to speak out loud. Now everybody.
Everyone's going.
Anything
I'm like,
that
I'm looking through the Q&A and I'm like, is there anything we didn't? Jeanine, I didn't really let you say what you think about 2028. What AI is going to look like then.
I hope we have a very
Oh,
functional
did we not
tool.
do that?
We
Yeah,
did, but I talked too long.
It was no, it wasn't you talk. You said everything. The main thing, Kate, was the integration. And I'm thinking about, how do we build out this tool? How do we make it free or very, 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 very cost effective for smaller organizations that lack those resources so that they can do it? One of the things I didn't talk about was the